Hi, folks. Welcome back again. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Darwin, but before we get to him, we've really got to understand where Darwin was coming from, where some of these ideas evolved from. Excuse the pun. Darwin relied heavily on the five, at the time, the five scientific disciplines. That is geology, paleontology, taxonomy, demographics, and biology. You're probably fairly familiar with most of these, but we're going to start out with geology. Geology is considered the reconstruction of the Earth's dynamic history. We now know that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, billion with a B. That's something new. Even in Darwin's day, it had been discovered and was being applied by a lot of scientists for a long time. At the time, they called themselves naturalists, but about 100 years before Darwin, that is in the 1700s, they were talking about this idea that the Earth was probably pretty old. A lot older than what the Catholic Church was saying at first. The person who came up with this was a Scotsman named James Hutton. James realized that the Earth today was formed and is being changed by forces like erosion and wind erosion, water erosion, and that kind of thing leads to it being old. Here's how. He came up with the idea that, okay, if erosion works on a river today, let's say the Thames, and if the river is being eroded at about 1 to 3 centimeters per year, then you can take an estimate as to how long it's been eroding to be as deep as it is. And then if you look at a canyon and realize that there's water at the bottom of every single canyon, you can realize that that water likely carved into that canyon. And he was realizing that if these processes that wear down rock over time, if they take a certain amount of time today, they took that same amount of time yesterday, the day before, and years and years and years. So by that, you can estimate how long a river has been eating away at rock by measuring how much of that rock has been worn away by the flow of that river. This idea was called uniformitarianism. It's a huge word, but think about it. Uniform, the same. Everybody who's in a uniform looks the same. Uniform means the same. Tarianism just means the belief of the uniform system. Therefore, what he was saying was, if we have things like canyons, which have been carved out by the erosive properties of the river on the stone, those canyons must be very old. He came up with this old Earth hypothesis, which was in direct confrontation with what the Catholic Church was saying, that the Earth, according to the Bible, was only about 6,000 years old. So James Hutton said, no, the science isn't really showing that, but he kind of backed off. He's known as the father of geology. He's really the one that derived a lot of the geologic aspects that we still use today in modern geology. After Hutton came up with this guy named Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell rediscovered Hutton's idea of uniformitarianism. And in fact, a whole lot of scientists around James Hutton's time were discovering the same thing, that there was evidence that the Earth is much older than we originally thought. Charles Lyell was working with uniformitarianism, but then went a few steps further. He's looking at these strata, these horizontal lines that you see down the side of a deep canyon. And he's estimating, you know what? Not only was James Hutton correct in that the Earth is old, but I think the Earth is in fact billions with a B of years old. How was he doing that? Let's look at what Charles Lyell was looking at and start talking a little bit about how he figured this out. This is the Grand Canyon. You know that in some parts of the Grand Canyon, it's nearly a mile deep. And if you look closely at this image, you can see these pretty obvious horizontal strata. That is, these horizontal layers. Now, Charles Lyell realized that those horizontal layers are being laid down using uniformitarianism today just as they were in the past. dirt, silt, stuff falls from the sky onto the ground, and eventually it builds up. You can see volcanic ash this way. You can see mud layers. You can see all kinds of different layers. And indeed, if you look at the side of the Grand Canyon here, you can see that this layering is very distinctive. Well, Charles Lyell was able to look at that and realize something that's probably pretty obvious to you and I. That is, the layers that are lower down are older than the layers on top of it. This he called the law of superposition, meaning things above, super, above, position, where they are. Things above are younger than things below. The law of superposition tells you how old in relative terms something else is. Let me explain it better with this graphic. What we're looking at here is a layer. Now, we're just going to concentrate here on relative dating. We'll get to numerical dating, or also known as absolute dating, in a minute, and I'll actually have another video for you to look at. But let me explain it to you this way. You see these different strata, right? You see these different layers. And each one of the layers looks different. In this layer, we have these shells. Way down here, we have other shells of trilobites. Using Lyell's idea of superposition, we can say these shells are younger than these trilobites. Does that make sense? This is younger than this because this layer was laid down first. Now, these days we have absolute metric dating, which will tell us the exact age of something. And certain things lend themselves better than other things to certain ways of doing this. We have, in fact, hundreds of different absolute dating techniques. The one that you're probably the most familiar with is carbon-14 dating. And with carbon-14, it's good for a certain period of time. There are other ones like potassium-argon dating and electron spin resonance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are hundreds of them. And each one is good for certain materials, and each one is good for certain time frames. So I'm not going to get into that. There are plenty of videos on YouTube. I may post one on here just to fill you in. Another thing is that fossils, which is what we're looking at, these fossilized shells, both down here with the trilobites and up here with the more modern shells. They're still 4.5 million years old, but still. What we're looking at here is a fossil, and I'll post another video on what exactly a fossil is, because that'll be very important as we go along. Another guy who is looking at paleontology is this fellow, Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke was one of the early adopters of a microscope. He was a big fan of microscopes. Here you can see an image of what he was using. You can see this is way back in the 1700s. It's a candle-powered microscope. He's got a candle behind a magnifier, which hits a reflective device, which then reflects onto or up underneath the slide which he's looking at through the eyepiece here. And what he was looking at was the structure of petrified wood. For those of you who don't know, petrified wood is literally fossilized wood. It's wood that's turned to stone. And again, watch that other video on fossils to explain these processes a little bit better. So his idea, which sounds really obvious again to us, was a radical new idea at the time. And that was, hey, according to the microscopic structure of this fossil wood, it is identical to the microscopic structure of living wood. Therefore, fossil wood was once living trees. Now, this was astounding because that meant in order for something to fossilize literally takes millions of years. So way back in the 1700s, Robert Hooke was saying the earth is older than what the Catholic Church is saying. He was agreeing along with James Hutton and Charles Lyell and some others that we're about to meet. This means there was a lot of evidence that the earth was much older than what the Catholic Church was interpreting the Bible to say. This is one of my favorites. His name is Georges Cuvier. Why do I call him Cuvier? Is because look at his kissy lips. Right here, he's got kissy lips. Georges Cuvier, actually, his name is on the Eiffel Tower. That's how important this guy is. But with a name like Georges Cuvier, where do you think he's from? He's from France, and this is meaningful because in the late 18th century France, that is 1790s and early 19th century, 1801, 1803, Georges Cuvier lived in France. What happened in France round about that time? The French Revolution. Now, I'm not going to get too political history on you, but let's just say that the church was essentially on the payroll of the kings and queens of Europe because it was God that ordained that they are or should be king or queen, which meant they owe allegiance to God and no one else. The church, specifically the Pope, was God's mouthpiece on earth. Therefore, the Pope and the kings and queens got very, very rich. The people did not. This got really bad under Marie Antoinette and Louis XV. So they were beheaded, the French Revolution happened, but here's why this makes a difference in our story. Georges Cuvier and others, including Lamarck, whom we'll meet in a second, did not have to be nervous about going against the church. France, in a way, was out from under that yoke, and science was allowed to flourish in these places. So they could say things publicly that you may not be able to get away with in places like England, Germany, and all around the rest of Europe. That is, Georges Cuvier, you'll see in his right hand, he's holding what looks like a spoon. It's actually a magnifying glass. But what's in his left hand is what's important. In his left hand is a fossil of a fish. And Georges Cuvier used to say, and of course, the Catholic Church's reasoning, or their way that they understood things that had gone extinct, we'll get to in a second, was the flood. The biblical flood had happened. Well, Georges Cuvier famously said, what does a flood do to a fish? And that is a stunner. Fish do fine in a flood. So he was finding fossilized fish again, underlying what James Hutton, Charles Lyell, Robert Hooke were saying. Georges Cuvier also came up with the idea of extinction. That was his word. He invented it. Georges Cuvier coined the word extinction, meaning an entire species dies out. And what would cause something like that, he termed catastrophism, or the belief of catastrophes. We know that one of the most recent catastrophes, at least that we know about, is the landing of the meteorite, which wiped out the dinosaurs. How did it do it? It changed the climate by creating a huge amount of discharge into the air that literally blotted out the sun for probably a couple of dozen years. Therefore, the plants died out, and if the plants died out, the big herbivores die out. If the big herbivores, which were dinosaurs at the time, die out, the big carnivores, which were also dinosaurs at the time, die out. This allows the little guy, like, I don't know, tiny little mammals, like our ancient ancestors, which, by the way, look kind of like a possum, to survive. They're smaller. They don't need as much food to make it through the day. Therefore, they do fine on the limited resources that were caused by what we now call a nuclear winter, but at the time we could call it an asteroid winter. By the way, in case you're curious, where did it hit? It hit in the Chicxulub crater, which is right off the Yucatan Peninsula in the Gulf of Mexico. This brings us to another aspect of Darwin. Now we've looked at biology, we've looked at paleontology to a lesser degree, we've looked at geology, but now we're going to look at taxonomy. Taxonomy and systematics. If you haven't heard of this before, what does it mean? It means classifying organisms and identifying their biological relationships, meaning what is related to what. Kind of like creating a giant family tree of the things on Earth. Early taxonomy was based on the idea that species did not change, and reflected what the taxonomists thought, as if there were more than one taxonomist. It was all one guy at the time, thought was God's purpose for them on the earth. We now know things do change, as we've seen with what Cuvier was talking about and everybody else, that living organisms, in fact, the earth itself changes quite dramatically through time. Given enough time, it changes a lot. And that's what they were all arguing for. Carolus Linnaeus, he's the inventor of this whole idea of taxonomy. Carolus Linnaeus was a monk. He developed a means to categorize all living things. This is something that we use to a greater or lesser extent to this day. The Linnaean taxonomy. Carolus Linnaeus was the guy who invented it. By the way, his real name was Carol Linnaeus, but he changed his name to Linnaeus because he liked to Latinize everything because he's a monk. Considered the father of taxonomy. He went out and started categorizing every single plant, animal, everything he could find. And his system of categorization we actually use today, even though now we know that it reflects who's related to whom and not so much God's purpose of it on the earth. But we also know that it can show us that fossilized forms that lead directly to a modern living form. This is an image from one of his notebooks. Carolus Linnaeus was a very decent author and wasn't too bad of an artist either. But if you see, specimen A is this grass of some sort with 2 stalks. Specimen B, 3 stalks. Specimen C, 3 stalks with mid-stalks. Specimen D, 4 stalks with a mid-stalk, etc., 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 all the way down. These are all basically the same plant, but they're different variations of the same plant. To do this, to understand and categorize these things, he came up with this. This is probably something that
Kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata. The class is
Mammalia.
Cause boobies, we gotta.
Order is primate, family hominidity, the genus is
Homo.
But you know you're enemy.
Cause I am in the species.
seen before. This is our taxonomic table. And if you haven't seen the top or you're not familiar with it, I bet you're familiar with genus and species. Because if you ask what our Latin name is for our species, we're Homo sapiens. Hey, that's where this all comes from. Homo sapiens sapiens, technically now, because we're a subspecies, because technically Homo sapiens includes Neanderthals. We'll talk about that later on. But kingdom, which is up here at the very top, kingdom, our kingdom, you can either be plant, animal, sponge, or rock. So what are we? We're an animal. The term animalia literally comes from the same root as animate, meaning if the animals can move under their own power, it's an animal. If it can't, it may be a sponge, a fungus, or a plant. We're not any of those things. We are animals. Subkingdom, Eumetazoa, phylum, Chordata, yada, 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 yada. We're going to explain what these mean, these categorizations, much more in the future. But for now, know this. We are primates, we're anthropoids, we're hominidae, we're Homo sapiens sapiens. All of this came from what Linnaeus originally started, which is pretty interesting stuff. This brings us to Lamarck. Lamarck's full name goes on for about 3 or 4 pages. He somehow survived the purging that happened during the Great Terror. He is also a Frenchman. He was also allowed to do his science basically unfettered by the church after the Revolution. And one of the things he was working on is how traits are passed on from one generation to the next. How aspects of what you look like are passed on from parent to offspring. The thing about Lamarck is that he almost got it right, but just missed the mark. No pun intended, only because he didn't know about some of the things that they knew about later on. But all of this will feed into what Charles Darwin eventually comes up with. Let's look at what Lamarck was working with. If you know anything about Lamarck, you probably associate Lamarck with the giraffe. His idea was called inheritance of acquired characteristics. And he was so close. We do inherit characteristics from our parents, but we don't inherit acquired characteristics. Let me explain. Lamarck noticed that giraffes these days have very, very long necks. And those long necks give them an advantage in this environment to eat the good stuff that other animals cannot reach. They're super tall, they can reach it, and they do. But we also, well, he also knew, as do we, that giraffes used to have short necks. There are fossilized forms of giraffes which have very short necks. So he was trying to figure out how they went from this to this. What he got right is they are descendants of each other. The long-necked giraffe did indeed come from the short-necked giraffe. Where he got it wrong was how that change happened. We now know it's mutation. But before that, Lamarck didn't know about mutation, so he thought it went like this. A short-necked giraffe was looking up at this wonderful food that it wanted to eat, and it started stretching its neck as high as it could throughout its entire life until eventually its neck got long enough that it could actually reach that food up there and eat it. Well, we know this isn't exactly how it works. That's the part he got wrong. What he got right was that now a long-necked giraffe has an advantage in that environment. So who's Mr. Long-necked Giraffe going to look for in a girlfriend or a wife? He's going to look for Mrs. Long-necked Giraffe, another one that spent her life stretching her neck, according to Lamarck. That's what he got wrong, but almost right. These two are going to get together because they see that as a desirable characteristic, and then their offspring are going to have long necks. Let me explain why acquired characteristics are not passed on. Let's say this. We know that you can work out with weights and get really big and burly, right? So if I work out with weights, my body will get big and strong. If my wife works out with weights, her body's going to get big and strong. And then if we make a baby, is that baby going to come out big and strong and burly? No. Because you and I know that our genetics do not carry that big muscular physique. That muscular physique was acquired through our activity during our lifespan. But if I have a big nose, my wife has a big nose, our baby's going to have a big nose. If I have blonde hair, my wife has blonde hair, our baby's going to have blonde hair. Does that make sense? Those are characteristics which are in my genetics. We're going to meet later on a guy who basically figured out what Lamarck had started working on. So Lamarck, with his inheritance of acquired characteristics, got it almost right, but not quite. He just missed it because he thought those characteristics were acquired. We now know there's inheritance of advantageous mutation, and that's the key.